Monster Hunter World is an impressive achievement both technically and for Capcom. It is the perfect example of what can happen when a company believes in its product so much so that they throw all of their faith into it and come out with a creation that has been constantly praised by fans of the franchise as well as newcomers. While the game does have a few shortcomings, the pros of the game largely outweigh the cons. I want to start off this review by giving myself some credentials as a monster hunter and a video game critic. I don't judge games until I have played them thoroughly. This can range from game to game, but in the case of Monster Hunter World, I have played well over 80 hours and have experienced all that the developers have to offer me. While when it comes to Monster Hunter as a franchise, I have played many of the games, but only when I was a lot younger. As you can imagine, I was not capable of understanding the nuances of the combat as a child, and while I was still able to appreciate what these games were trying to do at a young age, I was never able to fully experience the intricacies of the combat as I am today. So yes, I have played Monster Hunter games before, but not to the extent that I played World. So that should cover up everything in regards to myself. Now let's get into the review. So let's start with the basics of Monster Hunter. First and foremost, Monster Hunter is essentially a dungeon crawler. While these dungeons are not made of stone, make no mistake, they are still dungeons. What makes the Monster Hunter different is the way these dungeons are presented to the player. You are a hunter, and as such, you must scavenge the area for tracks and clues for the target or targets you are hunting. On your first hunt, this is necessary because you don't know exactly where the monster is, but it's not required to find these clues in order to find the monster. As such, you can just run around and eventually bump into it, or you can remember where you found it last time and go there, and usually you will find it. This takes away from some of the hunter-esque vibes from the game. As you play it more, you realize that monsters all have a sort of set path to which they traverse, which makes them feel less natural and a little less real. It's really a shame because when you really actually fight these monsters, they feel more real than any creature in any video game I have ever played. Their animations are almost flawless, and the way they react to what you do and what the other monsters do is a spectacle to behold. One of the coolest things that can happen is when two monsters engage in combat with one another. When you first see this, there's a sense of awe that I just haven't felt in a video game in a long time. But once again, unfortunately, these animations will repeat themselves every single time the same monsters interact, and the same animation will always occur with the same two monsters. Thus, some of the awe is spoiled as you realize that the moment of awe you had previously was nothing more than a glorified cutscene. I understand why this is necessary, but I can't say it didn't leave me disappointed on my playthrough. That's not to say it distracts from the experience. It's still very immersive to see these titans do battle and to see which one is stronger. It's essentially awesome to see a monster that you thought was the king of the jungle get destroyed by another monster. The monsters are very varied as well. For the most part, there's lizards, canines, bats, T-Rexes, and dragons. Unfortunately, the game gets a hard-on for dragons towards the end, but at least some of them have very different movesets to differentiate themselves from other dragons. I just wish there were more than just dragons at the end of the game. Essentially, what I'm saying is that monsters in Monster Hunter are great, and the hunting in Monster Hunter is also great as well. They just wear out their luster over time, and I think that is an issue that could have been solved by having monsters be a little bit more random. They do try to mix things up a bit by having a dragon that essentially invades your sessions once you meet the half point of the game. He can be pretty intimidating when he appears, accompanied by his amazingly terrifying soundtrack that plays whenever he appears, usually while you're in the middle of another fight. The problem with this guy is that you can just shoot him with a shit ball and he flies off, thus removing his threat completely for any player that has relative knowledge of the game. I think if he had been more invulnerable to this strategy, it would have made his presence more threatening, but he isn't. So that means that him randomly appearing doesn't solve the issue of the game losing a lot of its mystique the longer you play it. As I said earlier, when you get further and further in the game, you'll realize that every monster has a set path to which they will always go throughout a game session. When they get weak, they will always retreat to the same spot of the map they are on, and I really wish they have added more variety to the possibilities of each monster's AI. I think that could have added a lot to the experience. Speaking of variety, let's move on to the way in which you hunt monsters, more specifically the weapons and tools at your disposal to complete these tasks. There are 14 weapons in Monster Hunter World, ranging from a giant sword to a bow. I won't go over every weapon in this review because I don't think that's necessary. Instead, I'll go over the playstyles in which these weapons facilitate. In my opinion, there are only 3 of these playstyles: close ranged and slow, close ranged and fast, or long ranged. Each weapon allows you to take advantage of these playstyles at your leisure, and some even mix 2 of these playstyles together. For example, the charged blade is a very quick while in blade form, but has a long animation while it's charged up. The weapons are all very cool and have their own pros and cons to their uses. Once again, I do wish there was more variety here. Weapons in Monster Hunter are essentially characters in a fighting game. If a fighting game only had 14 character roster, I don't think people would find that very reasonable. So I don't see why these weapons are deemed by many to be an acceptable number of weapons, especially when you consider that the amount of combos for each weapon are very small. I remember when Bloodborne was released, there was a very large amount of criticism towards that game for its small amount of weapon choices. I would say Monster Hunter has the same amount of choices, if not less. Fortunately for Monster Hunter, the combat to which its weapons are involved in greatly outweigh the lack of variety, similar to Bloodborne. Combat is fast-paced and fluid, requiring the player to understand not only himself and his weapon, but the monsters and their movesets as well. This is all done masterfully, and although I have a few gripes about some of the monsters and their ability to chain unavoidable stuns into attacks, this is action combat at its best. But we've seen this already in the wake of the aforementioned Bloodborne as well as Dark Souls 3. What makes Monster Hunter World better than those 2 games in my opinion is also one of my favorite things about the game in general. That is the ability to use the environment to your advantage. Never have I seen so many different ways to use the things around you in an action RPG before, and it really means a lot to the experience. Granted, these opportunities lower later on in the game, and we'll get more into that later, but for the most part the environment can play just as much a role in a fight as the player can, and to me that's just brilliant. You can lead a charging monster to run its horns into a wall or shoot down a boulder onto a monster's head. There's so many opportunities, some of which I learned by accident because it just didn't register to me that the environment was a proper thing to focus on for a majority of my playthrough. This is most likely because I had never played anything like this. In fact, I pretty much guarantee that's why. Not only that, but you can use the environment with the help of the crafting system. You can use tools like the shitball I mentioned earlier to take down your foes. There are stun traps, drugged meat to put them to sleep, and even barrels to blow them up. All are great and have their uses, but none of them are required, which is also great. There's only one tool that significantly changes the hunting experience, and that's the ability to capture monsters using a strategy of getting them weak, then using a trap, and then using tranquilizer bombs to subdue the beast. Once again, this is not usually required of you, but in Monster Hunter, just because a monster is weak doesn't mean it's about to die soon, and capturing it while it's weak can solve some unnecessary frustration on some of the more difficult creatures. One of my biggest issues with the game though is that the strongest monsters in the game, known as the Elder Dragons, are completely immune to traps and thus cannot be captured. They're even immune to some of the environmental traps which I mentioned earlier. I know why this is. It's a Monster Hunter tradition as well as it's an arbitrary difficulty increase, but that doesn't make it any less of a flaw. Let me give you an idea of where I'm coming from using Pokemon as an example. Throughout the entirety of any Pokemon game, you are taught that certain elements have certain weaknesses and so on and so forth. You can take advantage of these weaknesses if you choose, or you can power through it. Imagine if at the end of the game, when you fight the Elite Four, they tell you that all that stuff you learned about elemental weaknesses doesn't apply here. Just fight without any of that stuff. You would be pretty pissed if that happened, right? In my eyes, this is what Monster Hunter World does, and I just don't get why that is. These Elder Dragons easily make up a fourth of the endgame, and yet they are immune to a fourth of what you were taught getting up to this point. I don't know, it just rubbed me the wrong way. With that said, the combat and monster hunting is a great experience. I can't take that away from the game. I had so many fun and memorable moments, and I guess that means that any issues I had weren't enough to be worthy of relinquishing that notion. However, there is one thing in Monster Hunter that I cannot forgive, and that is the story. Now I know I shouldn't expect a good story from any video game, especially one like this, and I didn't. I didn't expect the story at all, to be quite honest, but there is a story here and it's absolutely boring. None of the characters even have names. They're all addressed by nouns like Captain or Admiral. So clearly they were not trying to tell a great story here. The problem is that they force you to watch this story because the cutscenes are unskippable. Even in games where the story is the primary source of direction, the cutscenes are skippable. Why are they not in this game? It's completely unacceptable. I wouldn't be so hard on the story if I wasn't forced to sit through it all. There are some cool set pieces here and there, but it's nothing major, nothing I've never seen before. Were they so proud of this story that they couldn't add a skip button? I can't see why, because it's as bland and run-of-the-mill as any story I've ever seen in anything, even outside of games. If you want to keep it contained to video games, I would even argue that Pokemon has a better story, the original Pokemon. Once again, I don't want to be hard on the story, but the game didn't really give me a choice. It's terrible and I wish I could have skipped it. A single cutscene of the game can be up to over 8 minutes long, and there are many of them, so I have to say that they do detract from the experience more than they should have. This is also a good time to mention the dreadful loading times of this game, which last a very long time. Some clocked in at over 60 seconds on my PS4, which is ridiculous. Now, couple that with the fact that every single cutscene must be loaded, and you have a recipe for frustration. So, you'll complete a quest, load, watch a cutscene, load, go back to the hub world, talk to an NPC to start a new cutscene, and then load again. These instances appear more than a few times and can last dozens of minutes when added up. The issue is really the biggest issue of the game and could be alleviated easier than any other issue, which makes it very, very frustrating that I have to even talk about it. But those are my biggest gripes with the game, and I do think that most of the complaints are valid but glossed over by a majority of the community. That said, this is still a great game, and even with those issues plaguing it, I wouldn't argue that this is the best action RPG ever made, and I think that many would agree with me. I give Monster Hunter World a W. Thanks for watching.